Hello, and welcome to the Dying to Know More podcast. I am your host, Ashley Haugen. Today, we are going to explore the really fascinating history of the obituary, from the earliest death notices to modern digital memorials. And we're going to consider how obituaries have evolved to actually become a very powerful form of storytelling. Growing up, I remember eating breakfast at the kitchen table as my parents enjoyed their coffee and perused the newspaper. They'd kind of banter back and forth over various items in the news or stock prices or sports scores. Back then, of course, you had several sections of the newspaper. I remember you had the front section and the sports section and the business and entertainment sections. And somewhere in those pages, you had the obituaries. Um, you know, there would be, 2-3 pages full of obituaries. Some would have pictures, some would not. I think they were alphabetized, but they were largely people from all over the region, uh, the area in which we lived. Sometimes they'd have pictures that you could kind of get a sense of what they looked like, who they were. Um, you'd get a certain number of lines in your obituary for free, and then after that, you had to pay for the additional ones. Um, like anything, it's a business, but you obviously wanted to honor your loved one. And so, letting everybody know that they passed, so that people could come pay their respects, that was kind of the purpose. As my parents would peruse the obituaries, the commentary would range from, marveling at, somebody's impressive history or life story, or that you might recognize somebody that you knew. But there were really some entertaining names. You would see, somebody's name, and then they had a nickname in quotation marks. It might be like, Jesse Sharpshooter Jones or something like that. And it's like, only his friends called him Sharpshooter or something. There were just some really funny names, and we would get a chuckle out of them, not out of disrespect, but just, it was just the way it was presented. Um, I found the write ups and the photos and the mystery behind how these people died to be really intriguing. I mean, you might get hints at how they passed based on, who they asked donations for. So instead of, in lieu of flowers, send donations to such and such hospice center, or the Cancer Society or Alzheimer's Foundation or something like that. And you could kind of surmise what might have been the reason that they passed. Um, but if you saw that so and so died unexpectedly, well, it was kind of, as an obituary aficionado, which I consider myself, um, that pretty much ensured it was something, either they took their life, or it was a horrible car wreck, or some sort of fatal accident, or a massive heart attack. Um, when the obituary said someone died after a long battle, that they typically had a chronic illness, and those people, it often says they were surrounded by, loved ones and in their final hours, and we should all be so lucky. It is curious, though, how it's rarely mentioned how people die, but there are some, really bold obituary writers who will just come right out with it and just let her rip and takes all the guesswork out of it. Um, but in any event, these days I don't really enjoy breakfast with my parents as much as I wish I could, but we do still sometimes share interesting obituaries we've found. Um, the modern day obituaries are different, not necessarily in content, but mostly in presentation. But let's go ahead and explore how we got to the modern obituary. It's going to be a fascinating ride, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so let's start with the word itself, obituary. The word obituary is defined as a notice of death, especially in a newspaper, typically including a brief biography of the deceased person. The word comes from the Latin word obitus, I think is the right way to pronounce it, meaning death. Obituaries have deep roots. In ancient Roman times, like 59 BCE, public notices called the Acta Diurna, I hope I'm saying that correctly, daily papyrus bulletins listed events, anything from politics to notable deaths. They weren't really stories, but more like brief announcements, early headlines of life and loss, if you will. Fast forward to the 15th century and the creation of the printing press, which then led to newspapers that helped spread information faster than we'd ever been able to. And in those early newspapers were the earliest death notices. They were short, largely reserved for public figures. You might have heard them called bills of mortality or memorial advertisements. They were not so much personal stories, but public health style tallies, so like announcements. It might often be just the name, the date of the date the person died, the cause of death. But it could also be just 14 people died of parasite poisoning or something. They were just kind of announcements more so than anything personal. By the early 1700s, obituaries became common in larger newspapers. They kind of put an emphasis on the person, their morals and their religion, and encouraging people to kind of cause people to kind of take a look at their own life and mortality and how they were living. By the 1800s, obituaries were also social markers. So, major newspapers, New York Times, things like that, you'd find an obituary would have a large photo of the person and then a much larger write-up, and that kind of signaled prominence in the community, or if they came from a wealthy family or something like that. Whereas everyday people might still just receive notice in their hometown paper. Following in the mid 1800s, during the Civil War, obviously there were staggering numbers of deaths, and while people would find out about deaths of their loved ones, um, it was not from the newspaper, but the newspapers did publish long casualty lists and obituary style notices in an effort to keep families and communities informed of the soldiers who had been, killed in battle. As the 19th century continued, obituary writing actually flourished, kind of became a form of public mourning and literary art at once. They got a little longer, a little more detailed, blended biography with history. And then by the early 20th century, this is where kind of a fascinating turn of events takes place. So funeral homes were kind of becoming more and more common. Prior to that, families would, take care of their own family members' burial or what have you. And as family or funeral homes kind of came about, embalming, coffins, all of these things, true businesses, funeral homes and newspapers actually began to collaborate on the publishing of obituaries. So, and it kind of became templated and formulaic. So the funeral homes would have sort of a template, and it consisted largely of like 4 different components. So you'd have the death announcement, a short biography, a list of the survivors of the decedent, and service details. So where the person was going to have their funeral, when and where, and all of that. At the same time, so the funeral home would provide that information to the newspaper. It would get printed, and it would go out to the masses. At the same time, however, newspapers realized that this was an opportunity that they could monetize. They could charge for these notices, and so they did start doing it. Like I said before, in the newspapers, when we would read the obits growing up, at my kitchen table, I think at the time you get like 8 lines free, maybe, or 4 to 8 lines free, and then anything past that you had to pay for. Well, obviously you want to, tell the full story, and you want to honor your loved one. And so people would pay these overages. And ultimately today, I believe the last statistic I read is that the obituaries are a $500 million industry for newspapers. I mean, they make quite a bit of money. Moving on, obituaries, they eventually extended beyond print. So you have, the television was, gaining in popularity in the early and mid 20th century, and then you had radio, and it was usually, prominent celebrity figures, things like that, who would be honored in kind of an on-camera or on-air obituary. The host or the anchor might, show pictures and then tell the story of the person who died. Excuse me. But again, those were more prominent people, but they would spend, 2-3 minutes explaining about the person's life, what they did, their accomplishments, and then how they died, and then when and how they were going to be honored. And then another interesting shift in the journey of obituaries. Someone named Hugh Massingberd came along. And Hugh Massingberd was the obituary editor of the Daily Telegraph. He is essentially lauded with kind of reinventing the obituary. Whereas before they were kind of dry, formulaic, templated notices, he actually kind of turned it on its head, brought in personality, wit, told funny narratives, about the person, really brought the person to life on the page, so that readers could actually get a real picture of who this person was and how special they were. His influence literally reshaped the obituary writing space. So he's an interesting character in this kind of broader picture. Today, obituaries live in both print and digital spaces. So if you think back to the dawn of the internet, as in terms of consumers being able to access it, mid to late 90s, we all, more and more people got access to dial-up and could explore the internet. And businesses were realizing we need to be on the internet. We need to have our web pages. And so then, with that, funeral homes would, set up their space on the internet, get their websites, fill it in with all of their services and things like that. But then they also had the light bulb moment that they don't have to rely on newspapers to get the obituaries out. They too could publish obituaries on their sites and host that information. And so that's kind of where that brought in a new layer. So not only did you just have newspapers to tell the obituary story, you now had funeral homes who had their own obituaries. And then, of course, you've got legacy.com, which is, kind of dominates the field. Obituaries, guest books, all of that for all the states. And so you've got a broader array of options from, where you can read your obituaries and learn more about the people who may have died that you were unaware of, or you can search for people's or obituaries, things like that. And then finally, obviously we live in an era of social media, which adds a completely different layer to the obituary topic. So whereas before you might be limited by lines on a page, or just a template and providing the basic information, you bring in social media and you've got an entirely new catalog of options to choose from, so to speak. So you've got, memorialized Facebook pages, and you've got Instagram tributes, and you've got TikToks, and, all of these things kind of act as modern obituaries. People can honor those who have died with, by sharing videos, bringing the person back to life, so to speak, with, tons of images. They can write something as well. They can get comments that, people can share their own stories about these people. And it's a really different and interactive experience, and an interesting way to pay tribute to somebody who's passed before us. And the reach of these on the social media is like incredibly much wider than any newspaper could ever be. And the most interesting thing to me is that when you think back to like growing up, like I don't think there's any way that our ancestors could have ever get their head around what the modern obituary might look like. So I think that's really fascinating. Anyway, that's it in a nutshell. Modest roots of, death notices to viral memorial videos on social media. That's how far obituaries have come, and I hope you found this interesting. Thank you for joining. I'm Ashley Haugen, dying to know more.